Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Nick, Shepon, and I are here for yet another installation of sharing with you some of the thoughts that we have been sharing in our newsletter. And so I'll just launch into the contribution that I had. So what I tried to do is explore my evolution as a scientist in working at the intersection between business and science. And like a lot of you, a lot of my colleagues, I got into drug development because I was kind of enamored by the idea of being able to apply my scientific curiosity and interest in ways that ultimately would improve the life and welfare of patients. And you very quickly learn when you work in the pharmaceutical industry that despite the fact that I might have come in thinking that it was a business-based science, the reality is that it was a science-based business. And so even though, because of the kinds of things that I did, I spent most of my time thinking about the science, and it was very much focused on doing meaningful things for patients, there were decisions that were made that were more driven by the business than the science. And that's just the reality of the way that is. As I've evolved my career and worked not just in pharma, but in academia and in government, you really start to get an appreciation for the varying ways that folks consider and even measure value. And I think that, personally, from my experience in working in again, a science-based business, that I probably spend a little bit more time thinking about value and value propositions and strategy than most pure basic scientists. And so at some level, I think it does make you certainly a different scientist and maybe even a better scientist because you think about ultimately the impact of what you're trying to do. So it was an interesting opportunity, as is often the case for me, to kind of explore my experiences and relate some of that. So Shepon, over to you. What were you thinking about?
Yeah, no. So thanks, Brian. So I mean, to me, I'm lately just getting obsessed with the ROI, right? And so kind of continue on that business aspect of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of different things that we consider and a lot of things, we talk about the patient and even like animal reduction aspect, but in reality, it's all driven by money. But that's necessarily not the best incentives for us, right? So one example that I kind of think about, right? So there's a study that was, started, let's say phase 2 clinical trial, right? And then it stops for whatever reason, safety, or the technology wasn't working, or the endpoint wasn't the right one. We didn't reach it. And then so we just drop it and then we move on, right, to the next thing. So one, there's no return on the learnings, right, that we just did and potentially even spend millions of dollars and 6 whatever number of months on it. And so I think that's the opportunity that's lost, right? And us constantly thinking about the financial ROI prevents us from going back, right? Because currently we don't see the financial ROI on the learnings and going back and reassessing that. And we do that quite often. I mean, even just as a simple thing, one of the aspects that when I joined large pharmaceutical company, this is a while back, one of the questions I brought up was like, do we have a database of animals, models that helped us get medicines on the market? We didn't have that. Nobody had that. To this day, we don't have the database across our industry, let alone individual companies. There are some companies that are starting to compile that, right? But that would be a huge learning, right? If we learn in this one area on this animal model, we should probably consider it again, right? If we're working in the same area. So I think for us, reassessing what that the acronym ROI stands for, right? And how do we calculate it? And then also the ROI, the return on the intent, right? So this is where I'm thinking about, the impact for the patients, right? Not just that financial ROI for the company. And sometimes there is that disconnect, right? When we're looking at cutting programs because it doesn't necessarily make sense financially. So I think for us, looking at the return on an investment, which is imperative, right? We need to do that because it's a business and moving forward, we can't do it without it. But then also consider what's the ROI on a return on the learnings that we're missing, right? How we can go back and learn from it and actually reduce our costs. And then also, what's that return on that intention, right? Which we're here for, right? It's to help our patients. So I think we have to broaden that discussion. And if we're just going to continue to just drive that bottom line, I think it's going to make it more difficult for us to actually get humane, safe, and efficacious medications to our patients. I don't know, Nick, what are your thoughts? Or yeah, Brian, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, let me just say something about what there were two things that you wrote about that really resonated with me. One is that, and you didn't just use these words, but you have started using these words, and that is developing a learning culture. I think that is such an incredibly strong, powerful kind of a concept that really is a very much a part of what you just described. The other part of it was measures, right? I think we're driven by economics as sort of a measure of that return on investment, because it's easier to measure the economics than it is a patient impact. And so we default to the things that we can measure easily. And so some part of that equation is we just need to get better at measuring impacts that aren't just dollars and cents, to be able to understand how to incorporate them into our value proposition.
Yeah, and so to even expand on that, Brian, right? So the one example that I went through, which, I kind of use all the time, right? But it just made no sense to me. So we're working on a project on digital measures, right? So it took me a couple of years to really get to the level where I was able to explain to different stakeholders the impact of it, et cetera, right? And then so I'm pretty much like, we're going to this meeting. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get the funding for it to move the project forward. And one of the things that was brought up at the meeting is, well, we can bring in these refrigerators and freezers that reduce our energy by 25%, right? So the ROI on that was pretty rapid. That within, I think it was like 12 or 13 months, you actually pretty significant impact on actually paying back on that investment, right? So when you look at the financial line, for mine, the outcome was, so we potentially are going to have a better or more confidence in our decisions going from one stage to the next, right? But the question was, well, what's the financial ROI on that? I said, I can make up numbers, right? So we're going to reduce, we're going to get to the market faster and et cetera. But I just couldn't do that, right? Because it drives me crazy when we make up those kind of numbers. Yeah. And then so when the decision was going to be made, that investment was pretty similar for both projects. It's the operational aspect that came in, right? It's the refrigerators and the freezers. And so if we continue kind of make those decisions on that aspect, I think that's going to be really challenging, right? For us to refine and improve how we do drug development discovery.
Yeah, agreed. Nick, you took us in a different direction. Tell us about
Well,
on the table.
You said a couple of things that are spot on. I mean, you talked about, you said the word evolution. You talked about, improving the lives of patients and different ways, both of you, for measuring the value of what it is we're doing on a daily basis, right? And that probably holds true for all of us. And as always, I'm trying to look a bit broader as far as, what is this shift that we're seeing in what we think of as healthcare towards being more proactive and preventative. And then how does that manifest, with respect to AI, democratized for all of us. And then you can always wrap that back into what that means for pharma or health systems or physicians as well. But in this particular month, it's holiday time, and my mind was on food and holiday meals and feeling full. And how, what was a train of thought? So, but all over the world, I'm thinking there's, my mind's there for good reason, right? All over the world, there's people of every ethnicity, religious background, or lack thereof, gathering with friends around the dinner table or the fire. So we've evolved with things like food and with exercise, and our bodies need both. We've evolved to be social creatures. That has helped us to find food and to take care of each other. But we didn't evolve with everything that's present in today's world. We did not evolve with social media and other forms of AI, digital addictions. And you can think about that. Therefore, I think it has a propensity to kind of hijack our own machinery, provide the huge dopamine spikes associated with some of the things we're supposed to be doing, like, celebrating with friends around the table. but through kind of shallow experiences, and it can dysregulate other transmitters, hormones, more like serotonin and oxytocin, etc. So, unlike other things we enjoy, from food with friends to walks in the park, one of my points was that our brain doesn't know when enough is enough, like our stomach does, right? And it's not aware that it's not quite getting the full experience, right? We're all aware as adults we can't just eat only cotton candy, for example, right? Like, our bodies evolved, to help us understand this, and certain things we're just kind of completely vulnerable for. And so now to start tying it back, here we have a technology in AI that's been used very successfully for, in all aspects, and maybe less so in health, because it was chasing dollars, e-commerce, entertainment at first, but it's now single-handedly helping to fuel a mental health crisis, a loneliness epidemic. And can we start using the same technology, and now we're trying it back further, right, along with the right metrics, to improve human health and lives, and to add value in very deliberate ways to counter these negative effects. And I think that deliberateness, that value orientation lens is exactly the same as what Brian and Shepan were talking about.
Yeah. One thing, as you're saying that, one thing I didn't think about when I first read your piece was the varying levels of control systems, right? So if I'm eating, either my brain tells me I'm done or my plate's empty.
Yeah.
When I'm scrolling through social media, there is no empty.
Yeah.
It's just continuous. So if my brain can't shut it off, there are no controls. So that really is a problem. We have not evolved to have the same kinds of control mechanisms, which was the point of your piece. So
I like that, and I picture this never-ending plate where you eat it and it's belly. So.
Yeah, it's a golden corral of endless buffet.
I mean, one of the things that we even talked about earlier today, right, is going back to that return on the knowledge, right? That we have ridiculous amount of knowledge, right? We have ridiculous amount of publications, but we very rarely go back, right, and look at what was published in 1960s or 1970s, right? It's always looking at what has recently been published, because we're just showered with so much information, and so many peer-reviewed papers are coming out on daily basis, and especially now when you're looking at machine learning and AI, right? But we know that machine learning has been utilized for decades, right, in different shapes and forms, but we don't necessarily go back and learn from that. So, I mean, it kind of just even made me think about, right, if we're calculating the ROI, right, so running same or similar studies, be it preclinical or even clinical trials, and not learning from them, right, that's a huge investment, right? I'll be curious to actually look at, a pharmaceutical company, and let's say in 2025, what studies or research they have engaged with, right, at the early stage, right? And then go back and seeing what has been published on that over the last several decades that they have not actually took advantage of. And maybe the answer is none, right? Which I really doubt, right? Because even when, one time when I was looking at or asking they had this like survey, how do you pick your animal models, right? So, some of it was, well, my boss has used this for decades, so I chose it. I'm like, that to me doesn't necessarily make too much sense, right? Or, it was on the first page or second page of Google search that I did, right? I mean, now it's even evolved, because when you search on Google, the first 3 pages is advertising, right? So a CRO that does an amazing job on that's what's going to pop up. Doesn't mean that's the right model. And so instead of learning, right, from the publications or our research, which model to pick, we don't do that because we're so overwhelmed. So I think, some of the things, Brian, that you brought up, right, this whole, I guess what I mentioned in my piece, right, it's a culture of knowledge, right, culture of learning that we really need to start investing in. And I think when you look at the financial aspects of it, we will be able to make those folks happy, right, or our stockholders happy for those companies, because we will have that financial ROI.
And I'm happy to let's tie that back to what I was saying too, right? I mean, you talked about all these past studies, what can we learn from them? I think if I'm thinking the future of population health and prevention, if you could get patients out there participating, and what do we need to think of? Look at the ways we have of collecting data and personalizing things for a given patient. It could be how to make sure you don't have an exacerbation, be it asthma or these types of things. It could be how do you keep your cardio values down and fit, what works for you for also your mental health, focusing, getting things done, keeping your anxiety under control. And there's a lot of apps that can help with some everyday coaching, behavior modification. We're going to see a lot more of these as AI moves forward. But there's also closed loop feedback we can get. Pretty soon our phone's going to, if we want them to, we'll be able to keep track of what and how much you're eating. They can there's headphones that have EEG. I'll talk about those in the future. You can measure your pulse, blood oxygen levels. There's more and more, even if things, just your facial expressions, right, your intonations from your voice, and and anything else you want to volunteer. And so on the one hand, for an individual, they're going to be able to help you, deliver you some sort of behavior modifying or awareness or alerts, digital tool that's hyper personalized for you. But if you step back and you think like a population health, the same, people talk about wanting to learn from our past trials, from population, past trials, real world populations, electronic health records. But, this intersection and this real closed loop digital, feedbacks are also a great way to understand, especially for mental health. I have been giving it some thought. It's not just optimizing for a person, but, how many people claim to need help? What types of people are they asking for help with? Depression, with anxiety, what works best for them? Helping you learn actually what the unmet need out there is, learn who wants what type of solution, and then you can probably start quantifying any kind of initiatives you have. I've seen this with the Novartis Foundation in cardio or with mental health, like what back to your ROI, Shepan, right? Like what is being delivered and what does it look like in the real world? And then like you can slowly start merging like the view of the clinical program lead with like the view of like a population health official, and then designing things where you have both the molecular readout, but also real world quality of life improvement, things patients might care about phenotypically, right? And so it's still learning, but it's maybe more of like we're all participating and generating data that can justify that investment and show that preventions and prevention can work, as well as medicines in that space. We can pull back. So I think what seemed like very maybe different topics really align well under the hood. Right?
Well, in fact, another connection to what you wrote, Nick, relates to controls, right? So we've all worked for organizations that have believed that these AI capabilities, large language models, are going to allow us to sort of extract all of this past knowledge, Shepan, to your point, that we've been sitting out there and not using. It actually would turn that into predictions and ultimately tell us what to do in the future or what's going to happen in the future. But we've also recognized that it doesn't always give us the right answer, right? And so there's controls to be had in there in being able to, okay, so it can do that, but how do I respond to that? Does that generate an action, a health-related action, for example, Nick, to the point you're making, or is there a quality control action? How do I make sure that what it just told me is actually true? And we're already seeing that in real time, where with this in the context of hallucinations, where predictions being generated that just aren't true because relationships are being made that aren't real. And so I worry a little bit about taking a very passive approach to allowing the technology to lead us to where it's going to be and us not leading it. And I think that the point of us thinking through how you apply these technologies in the context in which we're trying to make decisions is absolutely critical, because we need the technology to do what we need it to do, and us not just sort of mindlessly following where it takes us.
Yeah. And so both of the things, right, that you guys are mentioning are pretty complex, right? You have different aspects that play a role. You got to look at that and how to calculate the ROI. And then, so one of the things that literally I just thought about is the case of, I'm going to mispronounce his last name. So David Hagenbaum, who is at University of Pennsylvania, right? So he was diagnosed with a life-threatening disease. His doctor said, we ran out of treatment. There's nothing left, right? So him being in a room, at least that's the way I heard his story when he presented here in Boston, is that he was just going through publications, right? And one of the publications found a medicine that was being utilized for something else, but because of the receptors and et cetera, right, he thought it's going to be a good, potentially life-saving medicine for him. And that's what happened, right? So now he's with that. He actually just, not just, but he started Every Cure. I just learned actually there's going to be a movie made about him. But to me, that was pretty basic, right? Not using machine learning or AI, right? Or some fancy other aspect. And I know we repurpose medicines, but not in the way he did that, right? I mean, he literally did searches on PubMed and found his medicine that worked for him. And now he's helping other people. And there's multiple examples of that. And to me, that's where the whole idea of learning culture, right? Of the ROI or the ROI on the knowledge, and the return on the learnings that we're really missing. I mean, that's a great example, right? If there was a pharmaceutical company, they would have loved it, right? Because it's very rapid, literally just go through a literature search. And I'm not sure that we truly, really do that when we are even looking at repurposing medicines. Or are we starting to look at novel things? How can machine learning, for example, help us? Or how AI can get us there because that's where popular versus just doing a basic background research.
That's interesting. And the irony of that is when you look at how much the industry has invested in repurposing relative to the total investment and what he did. And there are lots of stories like that where somebody took a drug that had been dumped, resurrected it for something completely different, and it was successful. So from my perspective, we're putting lots of investment in capabilities that I don't think actually are returning on that investment, because we haven't thought them through and used them strategically and deliberately. And we could get into a whole big discussion about, non-animal approaches and how that is played out, is playing out is a perfect exemplar for that right this minute.
But I guess, Nick, so sorry, Nick, I want to, because I can't help myself here, right? So as a veterinarian, right, and as a pet parent, right, and I'm looking at two-legged patients, right, and four-legged patients. And one of the things, talking about repurposing, right, we use so many, we use animals, including dogs, right, for our studies. And there was a couple use cases where we're doing a clinical trial on dogs, and it was a chemo drug, or anti-cancer or cancer drug. And then so there was a client, right, that found, again, the dog was diagnosed. There was no really good options there. And we were testing medicine that was kind of working in a cancer area in a similar aspects, right? And then so we were saying, we're trying something here. That pet parent of that dog was willing to, try it as well. But because of various legal things and aspects, etc., we didn't take advantage of that. And I think because there's such a discord, talking about silos, right? So the human medicine versus the veterinary medicine, we're so siloed. The whole aspect of One Health, which is supposed to bring, right, the environment, the animals, and us together, has been around for decades. It doesn't really work. But that's another opportunity, right, for that ROI, right? So you already are testing this. You're running into those species, right? Maybe a little bit of an extension of that. And then you can also save lives of our four-legged patients as well. So I think that, the learning culture is really need to be, taken up. The more we talk about today, the more heated, I guess, or excited I'm getting that this is what we got to just, start doing. And maybe that's one of the objectives for us for this year, to kick that off.
Yeah. And one of my first and remaining most excited ideas or aspects of AI was it, especially in a huge, like 100,000 person corporation or a huge distributed field where, kind of peer professors around the globe, Institute of Science or a pharmaceutical company, was just being better aware of what knowledge we already have floating around everywhere. And that's kind of how Brian opened. But, for me at the time, it was like, man, I have these stories about how, somebody ran into somebody in Japan who was aware of this target and had all this great stuff, but like wouldn't it have been great if they would have run into them 9 months earlier, and these types of things. So how could we actually make knowledge more discoverable, more, or, whether it's active or passive, right? Leveraging AI and these large curated systems, it could just be, structuring and manual exploring, or, it can also be, AI delivering some kind of alerts or suggestions, however we want to do it. And that aligns well with repurposing. You'll see examples, if you think, people talk about knowledge graphs, right? It could be a disease and a compound, or a target and a disease and relationships. And, whether you think of it as a graph or an abstract space, whatever, right? If you're an ML person, but, a lot of that is predicting, new relationships. So, you have target, and of course, drug works on target. Other indications might be wired to that target. Immuno-oncology, when that resurfaced, this was an obvious place AI probably would have identified first. People eventually did, but you have these silos. It could be different therapeutic areas. It could be people and animals. It could be all kinds of things. And can we, when we're working in a certain domain, can we have a system that can go out and grab the information that is out there and well established, or even make some basic inference on that, to help you along. And yeah, I was thinking it's not just new indications for an existing drug. A lot of times, combo therapies. I've seen this is a hot area to try to apply AI to as well these days. And now you're talking even on veterinary medicines, and so I think and one of the other themes we'll talk about later is we even have the possibility to deliver the same payload to different types of cells. Now, that was a hot topic this last year. So I think there's a lot of knowledge out there that we could be better bringing. And my initial thought was while I was at Novartis, was just like better finding people who could help me further my own train of thought, and who probably have something in their head that could be beneficial to me. So yeah, how can we all better learn from each other? And then, that's part of why we're here, the three of us as well, and hopefully to be learning and exchanging with the audience that's out there as well. So
yeah, and I know, because you're hitting the time here, but one of the other, so I talked to a bunch of colleagues this week, right, from JP Morgan, and they come up with all of the learnings, right, that they brought back. And I'm actually thinking about the now, right? How much of that is actually going to be implemented at the companies where they go back, right? Mm-hmm. Very little. I mean, and we do that all the time, right? We go to all these different conferences, and the knowledge transfer from the actual conferences into our companies, it's pretty limited. And it's so the whole idea, right? Again, like putting all those different things together. But maybe since we're coming up with time, Brian, any final words, Brian?
No, I think other than the fact that this interaction, I think, perfectly demonstrates the kind of value proposition that we all, that sort of drew us into working together, the three of us, because we all come from it from a slightly different perspective, even though we have the commonality of having experience in working in pharma. But I think as we talk through these things and we sort of play off of the ideas of each other, may not be crystal clear in our writings, although we try to relate them to each other. In talking about them, we easily make connections in the things that we're thinking about. And so I think this is a perfect exemplar. And every time we have these discussions, I'm excited about the next newsletter. So it's just, I hope it's of value to the folks who watch it, but it's certainly of value to me because I just enjoy the conversations and the ideas that come from them. So another successful chat, I think.
All right. Thanks so much, Brian.
All right, awesome. Well, whoever's listening or watching us, we're looking forward to you guys listening and watching us at the next episode. Cheers.
Bye, everybody.